everybody. I am so delighted and honoured to have STILLTish with me today. I'm really pleased that you agreed to come and have a chat with me. I hold you in such high regard. Tish, for those of you who don't know her, is a prolific researcher and collator of basically the macro, meso and micro facets of transgenderism and literally everything that's going on with regards to gender critical issues. She's got an extensive blogging site and a massive Twitter following, with 30,000 people who all call upon her work and analysis of many of the complex areas going on, and it literally feels churlish to only speak to her for a short period of time, really. She has a compendium of information, which is at Gender Critical Woman blog, and I'll put a little thing at the bottom. I honestly really do feel like a kid off to the British Library with a sandwich and a backpack, Tish. And I actually feel like I need some kind of annual pass to have chats with you. So I'm looking forward to hearing about your thoughts and having a little bit of a chat with you. So, an enormous welcome.
Thank you. I'm just a huge fan of your work as well. I mean, I think that's what I really love about, as tragic as this has been for me personally on many levels, the amount of work that has been done by women and also now new men and gay men in particular. We are starting to build a real, and people look at all the different facets of it. So there's always a learning curve, I think, for everybody, because it is a hugely complex topic. So obviously my jumping off point was that, my son is now trans identified. But when he was a little boy, we sort of intuited that he might be, he's very gender non-conforming, he loved baking, he's quite a gentle soul, his friends were girls. So we sort of thought we probably might be looking at a future gay adult. So we were very careful, just in little ways, because you don't want to foreclose an outcome, because some gentle men turn out to be heterosexual men. But we were very careful to just do the things like, when you get a girlfriend or a boyfriend, to kind of signal that that was fine with both me and his dad. And sure enough, he did come out to me at about 11 or 12.
Right.
And then at 14, he suddenly declared that he was trans. And I don't think I had a huge reaction at the time. I didn't know very much about it, really, except probably the old-fashioned, there are these small number of transsexuals who need our compassion, blah, blah, blah. But then when I started to look at the ideology underpinning it all, I thought it's so rooted in sexist stereotypes. And it seemed counterintuitive for a woman who, I would say, I'm radical feminist adjacent, and that analysis makes more sense to me than this idea that if you don't conform to stereotypes that we were supposed to be challenging as sexist and reductive and harmful for both males and females, and suddenly now we're saying you've got to carve those stereotypes into and out of your flesh. So that's my jumping off point, was why I started looking at it. And I've always kept those both those sides of it in mind, the impact on women and then what's happening to the young majority female now, but also I think it's something like 25% male who are being caught up in this ideology.
And do you think that his indoctrination started at school, or
because it was 7 years ago, and I didn't interrogate what was going on at the schools, because they did speak to me. They never affirmed him behind my back. They were happy for me to specify that he wasn't to use female changing rooms or spaces, which, to give him his due, he never has. He never asked for that, and he still doesn't do it now. They just made some little accommodations, like they didn't force him to play sports with the boys because he wasn't sporty. They just let him run around the track on his own, or probably walk around the track knowing him. And they didn't force him to use the male toilets because that's where he got bullied. They offered another option. So I think whether it was a staff toilet or whatever. But so they accommodate me. So the indoctrination of my son was actually through Childline YouTube.
Right. Interesting.
So Childline is run by the NSPCC, which is the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. It's the only charity that has statutory powers in relation to children. I don't think they can actually kind of take a child into care, but they can refer to other agencies. So they're a hugely powerful organisation. And they run the Childline YouTube. And the reason why I know that's where my son got it from was because he used to, because we're quite close and we would share things like comedy things, or we'd share films, and he started to share what looked to me superficially like boys, males. And I subsequently discovered that they were female YouTubers who were on testosterone.
Right.
And one of them did some sort of comedic thing where they impersonated their mum, but they were a female, LARPing as a male, impersonating their mum. And so there's a few little things that my son shared with me. And then I discovered that they were influencers that were being used by Childline. And that's why I'm reasonably confident that that was the source of it. So I did a 10-part series on the NSPCC. Yes. And not only were they, I analysed it. How many times did they mention the word lesbian? Not very many. How much was devoted to gender identity ideology? Pretty much all of it. They even did a horrific one about porn, which they have deleted. And I don't know whether that's because of my blog, but they deleted it. I downloaded it on my laptop somewhere, but I've got screenshots. That blog was giving children, bearing in mind it's targeted at under 18s, search terms for extreme porn, including hentai, which is actually banned by the Australian Border Police. If you try and import hentai into Australia, you're not allowed to.
Right.
It's confiscated. So I did a 10-part series on Childline. They were the ones for me. I have also formally complained just recently to the NSPCC, and I am intending to escalate that complaint now to the Charities Commission, because so that's the main source for me, was that site.
I did notice that you'd done a series on Childline, actually, and I'm finding it fascinating just how these things just keep all linking together, and the people, the organizations, the pornography keeps coming up again and again, because I guess, you know, children and schools, you know, they're the kind of material output, really, aren't they, for all of this? It's like they're in a big manufacturing process, and in fact you went a step back, didn't you, and looked at the kind of global corporate conglomerates, looking at the institutional capture, and went completely forensic on it, and looked at
interestingly enough, I did it with a group of women across the globe. We had a sort of like a Zoom group with Jennifer Bilek.
Right. Wow.
And we were intending to perhaps look at this globally and have different country sites. And when I first did that, I thought, no, it's not going to be the same in the UK. It's not going to be the same context. Either Ireland's going to be different, Canada's going to be different. Some of that's to do with the fact that we've got an NHS, and some of it's to do with the way that capitalism manifests itself in the UK compared to Canada, and then again differently in the United States. So I was convinced there wouldn't be these huge foundations pouring money into the UK. I thought that's not going to be the case. I was completely wrong. There are many foundations pushing this ideology in the UK. Some of them are US campaigns who were giving money in the UK. So I did a piece on the Arcus Foundation, which I only looked at because of the work of Jennifer Bilek. They are funding quite a lot of things in the UK, even things like Muslim women in Birmingham, odd little places that they're funding. And then there are foundations that are based in the UK, like do you remember the Barings Bank that collapsed after the Nick Leeson case? They've got a foundation that still exists called Barings Bank. Barings Bank were funding the all-parliamentary group on lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, all of that now. And they bankroll that parliamentary group, which is a cross-parliamentary group but they funded that group, and they funded at one point, the secretariat was done by Stonewall. Again, we know that's now a transgender lobby group, and also Kaleidoscope, another transgender lobby group. So that seems to be pretty captured. So there's all these little links. And then the other thing that I've done, which is quite important as an ex-Guardian reader, when I looked at the Guardian, I couldn't understand why they were being so poor about women. So they did a big campaign about trying to move a trans-identified male into the female prison. And this was a pre-operative male who'd actually been sent to prison because they had been breaking into homes to steal little girls' underwear, which they were using for sexual purposes. And yet the Guardian didn't mention any of that until people called them out for it. And it turned out it'd been covered better by something like the Burnley, like a local paper in Burnley. So then I thought, none of this is adding up. So I looked at the trustees of the Scott Trust who oversee the Guardian. They're the ultimate arbiter of editorial policy in the event of any disagreement, and they can fire the editor, Catherine Viner. One of the people that sits on the Scott Trust also sits on a foundation called the Paul Hamlin Foundation. When I looked at the Paul Hamlin Foundation, it turns out that they're giving money to mermaids and various other lobby groups. I want to say gendered intelligence, but it's definitely, there are various lobby groups. So I covered all of that. And then I thought, well, that's why they're hampered, because they've got the conflict of interest built into their trustees. And then I happened across a post by Julian Vigo. And she mentioned some money that they'd got from the Open Society Foundation. And I'd come across the Open Society Foundation before, because they're pushing a lot of money into this, spreading this ideology. I mean billions, a lot of money. So then I thought, well, yeah, the business model for papers is difficult now because people aren't buying papers, and it's challenging, I've no doubt. I used to buy the Guardian every day and the Observer at the weekend, but because of their stance on women, I don't anymore. So it's like I suppose it's.
I mean, if you think about global investments in hedge funds, of course, people within the UK who are affluent and are still making incredible amounts of money from the global phenomenon that is the surgery, the puberty blockers, you know, the hormones, etc. And their exposure to the UK markets are probably actually quite limited. So it's well within their interests to seed small amounts of money into stupid little projects around the UK, because the amount of of young people that they can convert into the system will benefit them globally in terms of their uptick and take up, into cosmetic surgery, private practice, and blah blah blah.
Yeah, well, I did
pharmaceuticals.
I did a post, not on my blog but on my Substack. I did a post on the billions and the projected growth of the surgery. This was just on the surgeries. Germany's quite a big player, and bearing in mind, the European Union are very behind this as well. So I looked at that, and I think it's something like, they call it the CAGR, which is the compound annual growth rate. And a good CAGR is something like 15%. The CAGR for the surgery is something like 29%. And then if you look at the fact that once you're on the hormones, you're on them for life, unless you detransition.
Yeah. And
the makers of Triptolin, which is the UK puberty blockers, you might see Lupron mentioned in the US context, but in the UK, it's Triptolin. The makers of Triptolin are Ferring Pharmaceuticals, and they have given 1.4 million to the Liberal Democrats,
yes.
who we know are all for this.
Yeah.
So it's money is definitely.
Oh, it's a huge
driver.
And actually not many investors actually go for ethical investments, because if you do, you're not going to make a huge amount of money. So, so, I mean, we talk about Denton's document, and you did mention it. Do you want to mention a little bit more about that? Because I did reference your blog, in a number of videos, some videos.
Yeah, well, I'm indebted to the knowledge of that document to James Kirker, journalist, in one of his pieces.
Yeah.
But what I like to do when I see reference, I mean, it's probably the way my mind works, really. I like to go for the detail. I like to get the original document. I like to download it so it doesn't disappear. It did actually disappear from the Denton's website, apparently. They're a global firm of solicitors. So I downloaded that document and went through it, and it's like a blueprint, an advice manual for how you can embed gender identity ideology in government. And it's full of tips like, right, for example, if you're thinking about civil rights, most movements want visibility when it's a civil rights campaign. I can't think of any other movement that was a genuine civil rights campaign that wanted to hide what they were doing. But the Denton's document makes it clear. It says, avoid press coverage. So it's basically advising you to go by stealth. Tie your agenda to popular legislation. So, for example, in Ireland, everybody wanted to get gay marriage and everybody wanted to change the law on abortion. So what you do is you tack, first of all, you tack your movement. So you start building alliances with women's rights organisations or with gay rights organisations. You build those alliances and then you force team those groups with your agenda and you build that loyalty. So they're going to support your agenda and you say that you're going to support theirs. So I've seen things like start talking about period poverty. Now that's a big thing that's come out of nowhere. You know, I'm not saying it's not a thing, but it's been used to feign an interest in women's issues, to get us to lower down our guard and think that we've got common interests with the spread of transgender identity ideology, when we don't. It's completely counter to women's rights and to gay rights. As I think is becoming clear. Sue Dominion, I'm probably pronouncing that, she wrote a piece called about astroturfing. And I'm going to mention names because I just want to say none of this is just down to me. It's down to me looking at other people's work, building on it, promoting it, referencing it. And I do like to acknowledge the fact that whatever I'm doing, it's because there's a community of people all doing different aspects of the work.
I think that's because you're an academic, Tish. Yeah.
Well, technically, I'm not. I'm an autodidact, I think. This probably describes me better.
I think one of the other things, you know, that they were trying to do is, you know, they're trying to, you know, get it all latched onto the children, because then they were trying to move it all into the education system.
Well, if you start indoctrination the children, so they're doing it as now. I mean, I've done a series of 10 on what's going on in the schools, which I know I don't have to talk to you about because you know all of this, but getting it in the schools, that's, what did the Jesuits say? Give me the boy at 7 and I will give you the man. Well, it's now give me the boy at 7 and I'll give you the potential woman. Is the new. So there's a lot on the education service, that all the education guidance documents, they're quite shocking. I mean, the one that I did on Equality, that was funded by the Government Equality Office.
Yes.
I believe it was Liz Truss who told them to take that logo off when they finally published it. But that was going into primary schools. It was even pretending to children that they could be breaking the law if they correctly sexed another child. Deeply sinister stuff.
I see that a lot. I see that an awful lot within policies, school policies. I think there's also, you know, their transgenderism is innate. Then essentially we're legitimizing this issue in adults, and so I do think that there's a lot.
It's like a beard for orthogynophilic men. So orthogynophilic men, it's a paraphilia, which is a sexual fetish of themselves, their idea of themselves as a woman. And they try to make some research that says that it's innate. Actually, quite a few people within who would identify themselves, not many, because many deny it, but there are some who will say, I know that I am an orthogynophile. And they will try, some of them will try and say that it's innate and they knew at 3. There's no evidence for that. And there's some spurious studies that don't take into account, like one is brain imaging, claiming that there was a female brain. They didn't take into account homosexuality or neuroplasticity, which is when the brain could changes in response to whatever you're doing, how you're moving through the world. So I think the jury is pretty much, it's out, but it's doubtful that it's innate, because otherwise you'd find 100% of identical twins would both be identifying as transgender, and that's not the case. But if you can say it's in children, you're saying it occurred before there could possibly be any sexual motive. And what you've got to understand about autogynephilics or transvestic fetishes and men who cross-dress, it's deeply shaming. There's a deep shame about the fact that that's what they do, which is, it's not just wearing women's clothes, it's actually masturbating in women's clothes, often a relative's clothes, or sometimes even stealing from other people's houses. So it got that deeply disturbing backstory. But for them, what they want is to get rid of the guilt and to be normal, it to be normalized as an innate thing and a civil rights issue, when it's not a civil rights issue, really. The vast majority are men who've got a sexual fetish. But if you can say we've got a transgender child, that desexualizes the motives.
Yeah.
And it claims that it's innate. And interestingly enough, the adults reserve the right not to have any surgery, even some not to have any hormones, but they all want the children to be put on the hormones and have the surgeries.
You also went further and you sort of highlighted this sort of interesting dichotomy between this sort of genderist position where you said, you know, we've got, if children are born in the wrong body and we've got this sex being sort of badly assigned at birth, this sorting hat analogy, and transgenderism is innate as one theory. But then if it's then a programming issue, and we will need to fundamentally, you know, smash cis heteronormative power structures and degender schools, which is what I find, and I'm battling on a daily basis, and go gender neutral. Essentially, you know, we've got this indoctrinating education. Well, you can't have both things. So
no, exactly, it's exactly the same thing. It's like saying that sex stereotypes are innate. If they were innate, we wouldn't have built entire structures that separate out things for girls and things for boys, and dresses for boys and the dresses for girls, and, you know, active wear for boys. You wouldn't need all of that if it was natural, inevitable. You know, I'm not saying that there are elements of the way that we've evolved women, you know, and I'm not saying that there's no differences. There probably, you know, there's probably a span of how women are and how, inverted commas, feminine we are, and how I'm not saying on it, I don't dismiss that completely. I'm not a blank slatist. I think it's nurture and nature. Exact percentages obviously are hugely contested, and I do like reading up on research on that, because it is quite interesting. You've got your Carol Hooven testosterone book, and then you've got your Gina Rippon and your Cordelia Fine, and I'd like to read all of those because they've got some overlapping shared concerns and then some points where they diverge. And obviously I'm not a neuroscientist, so I read those as a lay reader just out of interest.
One of the things that I know you're interested in, and when I was reading one of your blogs on the marketing of the transgender child, I followed one of your links onto this BBC documentary on transitioning teens, which kind of you know, was on the BBC and led us down the pathway of puberty blockers, and, you know, how kids are getting hold of self-medication. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I did a series on the marketing of the transgender child, because a lot of what we're seeing is like a product placement. It is, and I think I owe that analogy to an Australian woman, and forgive me, I can't remember, but she did a really good YouTube about marketing and branding and how transgenderism is following like a business model. And I might be able to find and send you the link afterwards, but it was very good. So I did one on Becoming Leo, which was on Children's BBC. That was because who thought you had to protect your children from watching CBBC?
I know.
You know, that's what you'd leave them watching when you went to make the tea, isn't it?
Yeah.
But anyway, and then there was another one the BBC did, which was on a French child, Petit Feel, I think it was called. And then there was the DIY, and the transition in teens one was interesting because one of the women that was in that, who was a she identified as male, and she was planning to have a double mastectomy. And I did a thread on that. Before I did my blog, I did a thread on Twitter. And that girl contacted me. She was only 19, to say that I'd got it all wrong. She wasn't a lesbian. She was a gay man.
Right.
She wasn't offensive. She just said, lol, logic fail, I'm a gay man.
Lol.
And I had a look at her Twitter timeline, and it was all about AIDS and Section 28. And it's obviously those things had no pertinence to her life at all. What do? I just sent her a kind response and said, I'm not going to share that on my timeline because lots of my followers are gender critical gay men, and they might not respond to that because obviously I think that's one of the reasons that gay men are starting to step up, is more of these girls saying they're actually gay men, which, to be fair, I thought surely when people see girls saying I'm a gay man, they're going to wake up and think, no, this is all wrong. But no, we're still going on.
Yeah.
But yeah, the DIY model of getting the drugs, obviously in the UK, the main one is probably Gender GP.
Yes.
Who I think they've now established their jurisdiction in Hong Kong. I think there was a guy called Daniel who did a really good investigation into following all the corporate structures.
What was his?
So they're outside the UK jurisdiction.
Actually, I haven't seen him around for a while. He did a really good follow-up of that. I must find his name, actually.
I think he was the one who was instrumental in setting up tribunal tweets, if memory serves.
Right. Yes. I mean, I find the whole thing enraging. I mean, it's really easy to be enraged at the BBC at the best of times, but their coverage of the case of the Webberleys I did write a number of complaints about that. As someone, with a healthcare background, it really annoyed me that they didn't cover the importance of that. But even the fact that this documentary is still up, the abominable lies that were on there, the dodgy, methodologically flawed suicide data, the false narratives, this is what we keep. This is promulgated all the time, these false suicide narratives. It's so dangerous.
And what's interesting about that is I did a post on the Samaritans because I couldn't understand why the Samaritans were not calling this out.
Yes.
And sure enough, it turns out that the CEO of Samaritans was the woman who was at the Girl Guides when she made Girl Guides mixed sex. Right. Then she's moved on to the Samaritans. You can check her Twitter timeline. She's a serial tweeter of Ruth Hunt, Nancy Kelly, Stonewall, deeply embedded in that. But then even further than that, I came across the link that the Samaritans had with the Beaumont Society going back 30 years. So again, a lot of what I cover is kind of the cognitive and institutional capture.
Yeah.
Because it's everywhere. And even the BBC has taken loads of advice from like Trans Media Watch and various lobby groups. It never occurred to them to talk to women's groups in the same way, but they've embraced the lobby groups.
It's like why the Children's Commissioner, their office has done nothing because their director of external communications got a trans child.
Yeah,
it's the same. It's literally in every department, every office. This is the connection. This is the stymied.
I think Helen Joyce said that if you find why, you'll often find somebody who's got a trans identified child at the back of it. So like we were talking about before, that apparently the Women's Equality Party has taken thousands from a man who it turns out has a trans-identified child. So I was a founder member of the Women's Equality Party, but it very soon became apparent that it was not going to centre women.
I noted that illegal action that was being taken by Joe Mom again on the back of more fake suicide stats against NHS waiting lists for transgender, gender clinics, etc. But you only have to look at any NHS speciality to find exactly the same situation in most cases now. The NHS is in crisis as a result of COVID, especially. But, just going back to the puberty blocker thing, because you mentioned I Am Leo, which had got an Emmy Award, I noted. This live experiment on children, really, and then we had this Trans Plus unit of the clinics that have been set up. I mean, I do think that this is going to be the future, that this is going to be the rollout, this GP model up and down the country once these pilots are finished. I mean, you've talked quite a bit about the NHS.
I think just to really get back to the everybody talking about the delays, there certainly aren't delays for teenagers who get referred, because my own son was referred by my GP in November, and the drugs arrived just before Christmas.
Right.
And I only found them by accident, because I'm not a great housewife, and I'd left everything that I needed to do to the last minute, and it just so happened the vacuum cleaner was in his room. Well, he was 19, so I don't invade his personal space.
Yeah.
But I needed to get the vacuum cleaner, and that's when I found the drugs and I found the paperwork. So I know definitively what the timeline was. I think there might have been some blood tests done in the October, but the referral was on the 7th of November, and I found the drugs the week before Christmas. So there kind of been, it was during the pandemic, there kind of been no counselling. At best, he could have had an online session. So either he's getting them straight from my GP, or he's getting them from an online provider. And the drugs are delivered by a chemist who has been publicly linked to Gender GP.
Right.
So it could be either of those. So I think as you were saying, the DIYing, if kids can get access to them, teenagers in particular, online,
right,
and they can get the money. Yeah. And I know some parents are actually buying them for their kids.
It'd be interesting to see how that pans out with the NHS interim service specifications going forward, and how they implement that, because I've seen, obviously, the trans activists are obviously incredibly unhappy about the NHS saying that it won't take responsibility, but obviously they can't police that. That's the problem. It's not actually doable, because there's no
I know that one of the trans groups has got a spreadsheet, which I've got a copy of, where they go through all of the different regions and say which doctors will prescribe. And funnily enough, one of the people on that list is someone I was at university with,
right,
who was a doctor. And funnily enough, she was from a very kind of upper middle class background and described herself as a Marxist. And yet she would have been one of the non-conforming women that would have been very vulnerable to this ideology. She's on that list as a very pro-providing of the drugs. So that was quite interesting to see that.
I was just thinking about there was a comment that was on one of your things about Munchausen by proxy and homophobia. An American father said his child, she'd always been a girl. It was my daughter running down the street, not my son running like a girl.
Yeah. Yes. That was in one of the documentaries. And then, of course, you've got the case of Kai Sheppey. I think it's Sheppey or Shepley. That's one of the ones on the marketing of the transgender child. She makes it quite clear. She thought her son was going to be gay, and that was not going to happen. She was going to beat him out of it. And now he's a poster child for being a transgender girl. And she's an evangelical Christian. She clearly was not happy about having a gay son. But now the LGBTQ lobby have held her up as an icon. So I mean, it's deeply homophobic, this ideology, as we've seen with those recent, I think at the New York rally that Standing for Women was at, with the trans-identified male calling a gay man the F word.
Oh yeah.
A legend, apparently, someone who was deeply involved in the original Stonewall, and yet that trans-identified male, after he'd finished jiggling his breasticles in public, called him the F word.
He did, yeah. I cut it into the video that I did I put out yesterday, actually. I mean, what's your plans now for what are you going to be looking at? What's your direction? Because you've got so much work.
I mean, it's such a huge topic. It's never ending. So at the moment, what I'm doing is I'm working through Christine Burns, who's a trans-identified male who now describes himself as a mum, grandma, and lesbian. And he's written a book called Trans Britain, and in actual fact has done us a massive favour because he name checks lots of people. So you can it is a very long series, because what I tend to do is I'm covering the book, but then I'm hunting down information on all the people that are mentioned, just to kind of identify where the trail leads to who's. So there are men who are in the unions. I've done a mini series in between of the capture of the unions, and what you find are the mostly heterosexual trans-identified men who are now claiming to be women. They're taking even chair roles of the women's organisations within Unison. So I haven't finished that yet. I'm going to continue to follow all of that down. Then I've got quite a few. I've got an old paper on transgender Europe, so I want to follow all the links there. And then I've done series. I always go back to people like Stephen Whittle, who's had a huge influence on all of this. There haven't been. I'm hoping that we're going to get some sort of an event about prisons, and because I do a lot on prisons, for single-sex prisons, and the court cases about the first men that started to be placed in female prisons and the justification. And they're always good ones, because you'll often get people saying, oh, that's not really happening. Well, this is a court transcript, and I always link the court transcripts in. So you can bypass my commentary if you like and just go straight to the court transcript. So at the moment, and I have just had someone who's given me a tip off about another union. So I'm just waiting for that information to come through to follow back. Because the unions were very slow to defend women's rights and even gay rights. And yet they've swiftly embraced this ideology. I think it's partly because, well, in a bizarre way, some people are embracing this because they want to atone for the fact that they were slow to gay rights. But I also think something else is going on. If men can become women, it allows the unions to ignore women's sex-based rights, which they've never been good at. For Unison to do it when their majority membership is female, and then to give a man the chair of the women's committee. I mean, it just goes to show how deeply embedded misogyny is in this movement. If you haven't seen it, Megan Murphy speaking to Genevieve Gluck is very good about the way that women are not even perceived to be real.
Fully human,
yeah, it's very good.
We're subpar men, basically.
Yeah, we didn't, like just a man without a penis. It's not a woman, but it posits us as a lack, doesn't it? It's a deficit model of being a woman.
Exactly, yeah.
That we're simply non-men, which of course the Greens actually call us non-men in official communications. So I'm sure that, I'm sure that there will be lots more topics to consider when I've finished focusing on. I want to return then to mermaids. I've got a piece ready to go on, was it Jordan Gray?
Oh yes,
man who went naked on.
I think that their Instagram and Facebook has gone missing, apparently.
I've been sent, someone has been, again, because it's not me on my own, a gay man has sent me lots of links and screenshots. So I've got all that ready to go. And also they denied that he'd been going into schools. I've got evidence that he was going into schools.
We've definitely got pictures of him going into schools.
So that'll be him. And also going to do one on Jacob Breslaw, the Mermaid's trustee, because for my sins, I downloaded his PhD thesis and read it.
Interesting.
So I want to go through that. I also want to do more on, I think I've done a Twitter thread on it, but I never did an actual blog. I've got a thesis written by a trans-identified man about how BDSM, bondage, sadomasochism, embedded his identity as a woman.
Right.
And that was quite an eye-opening read, because basically he has a bad sexual encounter where he's the submissive, his safe words are ignored, and what he took from that experience was it made him feel like a woman, like women are just to be abused. And you can see that thread covered excellently by Genevieve Gluck in that discussion with Megan Murphy. Got people like Andrea Shum. I've also got, and I haven't got to write it now, I've done Whipping Girl by Julia Serrano. I've got that as a piece ready. I mean, I've not got to it now, because every time I get to a point where I think there's something else crops up that seems more urgent. So I've got that sitting there. I've already done a series on, I also want to cover a lot more of the women, because I've done people like Janice Raymond, the transsexual empire. I covered Anne Lawrence, an AGP male. I did a series on him. He's very, I mean, obviously we would not find common agreement, but they have done very detailed research and it's remarkably honest. So that's, another one. And I've done quite a bit on Martin Rothblatt, who again, he's a billionaire who's bankrolling a lot of this. And a lot of what he says, even though it sounds mad, and it was written in 1995, but a lot of the things that he said in the book that was called Apartheid of Sex first, and then became Transgender Transhumanism, but it's second edition of the same book. So I've done something on that. I also wanted to do something that I've done a thread on, but I've never blogged on it, about the link between prostituted males and transgenderism.
Right.
Because 68% of the deaths that are covered by the Trans Day of Remembrance are actually male and involved in prostitution. And if we really cared about those males, and I do care, because there's a man in my city, which is Leeds, and he was a gay boy, and his mum completely rejected him for being gay. He ended up being in prostitution, and there's actually a series, and it's just really sad, because he's looking for love, really. He's looking for love, and what he's getting is men who want to
abuse them.
Yeah.
One of my first jobs, when the HIV field, there was times where working on the AIDS wards got really very heavy, and I needed to have, we used to have like a bit of a time out and work in sexual health. Anyway, I worked with prostituted men and women, and I worked with the boy, very young, they were boys, they were kids. And I used to do street outreach in London, and they were incredibly fragile kids, homeless and really surviving on the margins. But interestingly, a lot of their clients, regular clients, were MPs and very important people in the city, etc. But and they would it's just they are genuinely surviving on the margins. But these guys, a lot of them had paraphilias, these businessmen, and they were happy to use and abuse young boys. And
well, I that's a thing. I think people assume that because I'm a trans exclusionary feminist, and I am absolutely nobody, not even my lovely son, who is lovely, don't belong in women's spaces. I'm unequivocal about that. But I actually do talk to trans identified males, some who would happily still call themselves transsexual. Some, in fact, I had a long discussion with someone in Scotland who's recently detransitioned, and we speak on the phone, and I regard them as a friend, and they've recently detransitioned and are navigating how they can, well, they've stopped using women's spaces, and so there are a lot of complexities in the mix, and the abuse of vulnerable young males in prostitution is something that I think about, because, you know, that could be my son. It's somebody's son, you know, and that I find quite heartbreaking. And in fact, the Labour MP, I think he's still a Labour MP, what's his name, Keith, he was caught with giving cocaine to rent boys.
Okay, right.
And the way he spoke about them was just like they were something less than nothing.
Yes.
And so I care about those boys. And the one that had I can't remember what the series was. It might have been called Sex Life in Leeds or something. And it had a couple of these trans. And of course, the one had been rejected by his mum. The other one had been in foster care. They were both gay. And they were living on the margins.
Yeah.
And, you know, finding a way of life that was harming them.
Yeah. And the drug use and the mental, you know, the comorbid mental health issues. And yeah, I mean, they're not destined to live long lives.
It's in that community are both victims and perpetrators. See, I don't think I'll run out of topics.
No, you have to come back, Tish. I mean,
yes, I will happily do so.
I could just sit and, you know, we could just wax lyrical all day, but you know, in the interest of time, I think we should probably you know, draw this one to a close and say I've just enjoyed listening to you so much. I mean, you are literally the British Library of Gender Critical Thought, and I've just enjoyed your company. You are amazing. You know, I'm sure everyone is so incredibly grateful for everything that you're doing, and I know that I have learned so much from reading your work. Everyone should definitely go and learn. There's so much to learn from your blog. So
thank you.
You know, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me, and hopefully we can do something else and come back.
Yeah, would happily come back.
Yeah. I was so tempted to go off in different directions. Sissy porn was just like,
yeah,
oh, can we do that one
too as well? But anyway, there are lots of women and men doing lots of work in this field, and if we keep promoting each other's work, listening and learning from other people, we will prevail, because it's built on lies. It is built on lies, and the body count, the harms that are being done to our kids. So I think that's the other thing that I should mention. I do try and I email my GP. I don't want to be at the same GP that's colluding with this, but I can't leave because I'm their patient. They have to accept me emailing them research. They don't acknowledge it, but I send them research. So, for example, males on cross-sex hormones have got a 5 times increased risk for multiple sclerosis. And I have that in my genes. So that means that my son has already got a genetic predisposition for it. Diabetes, type 1 diabetes, times 9 risk. So all of the people that are in this and taking the medical treatments, they are being poorly served as well, because they've been groomed into it, indoctrinated into it, and the research on the medications that they're being given, it's a very poor evidence base. And we have never before started young kids on this. You know, Jan Morris might have lived till they were 90, but he didn't do it until he was middle-aged, and he'd also had his children by then. And the astonishing thing is, a lot of the legal cases campaigned against enforced sterilisation to identify as transgender. These kids that are put on puberty blockers, followed by cross-sex hormones, will be sterile. And as Marcy Bowers, president-elect of WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, admitted, they won't just be sterile, they will be unlikely to be able to orgasm. Now, that is criminal.
It's mind-blowing, isn't it? We should just do a video just on medical harms. We could get SCAP to come back and do one together, couldn't we? That would be interesting. I could try and see if I could set that up.
Oh, just a last plug before I leave you. There's a YouTuber who's a detransitioned male called Isaac Uncook. And he covers a lot of this.
I think the reason that I decided to do this was because every time I went to research it on YouTube, all I could find was gender ideologue nonsense. And I thought, well, in a tiny, tiny way, if I can just lay down a few videos that are giving another point of view, maybe a few young people will find a different perspective, a different story. And if that changes one or two young people's ideas, or, you know, parents, then all be to the good. So, you know, it's worth it.
Now it's gone mainstream, and it is mainstream because it's supported by every blooming television company, political party. At least there are dissenting voices, but in general, and the establishment, it's in every organisation. Surely the next level of young people are going to start thinking what's to rebel against. I know my youngest is gender critical.
I think they're going to get bored, Tish. I think there's only so many. It's going to reach a critical saturation, isn't it? Really, where it's just there's too many.
Yeah, we need a cisgender inverted commas tipping point.
I mean, there's only so many non-binary people you can have in your class before you being, you know, you're going to have to go the other way.
Well, I was collared by my neighbour who doesn't know what I do. She works in a behavioural support unit for expelled pupils who are mostly not expelled, but they're mostly very damaged. And she said that they're starting to get concerned about how many of them are identifying as males or non-binary, and how they're all looking forward to getting testosterone. And she thinks that in some cases she knows, and in some cases she suspects, that many of those girls have been sexually abused. And that was someone who didn't know what I did, came up to talk to me out of the blue and asked me.
Well, thank you so much. And, you know, we'll speak again. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Take care.
I've got out of making tea, so it's been a bonus all round.
See you soon.
Thank you.